Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take those complex sources, really cut through all the noise, and give you the knowledge you need. Fast, thorough, you know the drill. Today, we're tackling a term that's, well, it's completely escaped the clinical world. It's burrowed really deep into pop culture, hasn't it? It's become this almost irresistible shorthand for a behavior that, frankly, we often just don't get. We're doing a deep dive today into the origin and the really lasting controversy of Stockholm Syndrome. You know the phrase. It's used to explain why a victim might bond with their captor, maybe defend the person who harmed them, or even reject the authorities trying to help. But our mission today is to push past that sensational headline. We're asking a pretty central, critical question here. Is Stockholm Syndrome a rare, genuine psychiatric thing, rooted purely in some profound survival mechanism? Or is it something maybe a bit more insidious, like a convenient narrative, maybe even a kind of cultural weapon, used historically to mask police failures, perhaps?
And crucially, maybe used to silence or invalidate the rational, self-protective choices made by victims across a whole range of abuses. We're going to be tracking this term from its really sensational origin, that botched Swedish bank robbery about 50 years ago, all the way to its highly controversial use in modern talk about abuse, cults, political loyalty, all of it.
Right. And just to start with the foundation, so we're all on the same page. Stockholm Syndrome, or SS, as it's sometimes shortened, it's basically defined as a psychological response. It happens when people in captivity or under really intense coercion start developing positive feelings, even loyalty towards their captors or abusers. And often this happens at the same time as they develop negative or critical feelings towards the police or anyone trying to rescue them. Now, when analysts actually look for this response, they usually identify 4 key things that kind of need to be present for the label to really stick. 1, the victim develops positive feelings for the captor. Pretty straightforward. 2, the victim shows negative feelings, maybe even active resistance towards the authorities trying to rescue them. 3, the captor develops some positive feelings back towards the victim. This is sometimes called Lima syndrome, a sort of flip side. And 4, this is really important. The situation absolutely has to involve face-to-face contact over a period of time. The victim has to believe they can't escape, and they genuinely fear for their life. The whole bonding thing, it's broadly understood not as, real affection, but as a severe trauma response. It's rooted deep down in self-preservation.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this then. Let's get granular on that founding myth, because the whole concept, the name itself, that's tied to this one specific, highly publicized event. We need to go back. August 23rd, 1973. Credit bank in Norrmalmstorg Square, Stockholm, Sweden.
That's the day. It started with a pretty disastrous bank robbery attempt by an escaped convict, Jan Erik Olsson. He fired a submachine gun into the ceiling, immediately setting this tone of absolute terror. And he took 4 bank employees hostage, 3 women, 1 man. They were held inside the bank's vault.
And Olsson's demands, they immediately escalated things beyond just a simple robbery, didn't they? What exactly was he asking for?
Well, his demands weren't just about money, though he did want about $700,000 worth in various currencies. It was also personal. He demanded that the police bring his former cellmate, Clark Olofsson, to the bank vault. Now, Olofsson was this known, kind of charismatic career criminal in Sweden, and amazingly, the police actually decided to comply. They brought Olofsson right into the bank, which, essentially introduced a second known dangerous person into this already volatile, closed environment.
Right, so now you've got 2 criminals, Olsson and Olofsson, and these 4 hostages, all trapped together in a bank vault for, how long was it again?
6 days.
6 days. And the sources emphasized this wasn't just stressful, it was like a calculated psychological game by the captors, right?
Yeah.
Using the constant threat of death to keep control.
Precisely. It was 6 days of just sheer psychological warfare. Olsson especially used extreme methods to keep the hostages completely subservient. At different points during the siege, he actually strapped dynamite to their bodies, forced them to wear it, or he made them put nooses around their own necks, tied to the vault structure. It's the ultimate fear tactic, isn't it? It makes the victims totally helpless, totally submissive, knowing that one wrong move from them or the police outside could mean instant death.
It's chilling. But what's really fascinating, or maybe disturbing, is that within this atmosphere of absolute terror, some kind of strange dynamic started to form between the hostages and the 2 captors.
Yes, and this is really where the term starts to bubble up. Over those 6 days, it wasn't just abuse. There were also, small, necessary decencies shown occasionally. They were given blankets when they were cold, allowed bathroom breaks. And crucially, the captors sometimes protected them from what the hostages perceived as threats, often. This meant the police trying to storm the place. Olsen was apparently more erratic, more threatening. Olafsson, on the other hand, seemed to keep a degree of calm, offered small reassurances. It kind of naturally set up this good cop, bad cop dynamic inside the vault. The source material really suggests the hostages began seeing Olafsson in particular as their protector, not just from Olsen, but also from the external threat, the police outside.
Okay, so fast forward. What happened when the standoff finally ended? The police intervened, but the rescue itself was pretty traumatic, wasn't it?
It really was. The police eventually used tear gas, then stormed the vault. And the chaos that followed was exactly what the hostages had been dreading. But the real shock for the outside world came immediately after their release. The hostages actively defended their captors. They refused point blank to testify against Olsen and Olafsson in court. Their loyalty seemed totally flipped.
Yeah, their actions after release just cemented this narrative. Kristen Enmark, one of the hostages, she actually called the Swedish prime minister during the siege, pleading for the captors' safety and demands. After release, she maintained that stance. Another hostage apparently started a defense fund to help pay the convicts' legal fees. And there were those persistent reports, often debated, sometimes misattributed, but they were out there that one hostage later married one of the captors. All this just amplified the public idea that something had fundamentally, broken inside these victims' minds.
Right. That baffling shift in loyalty, refusing to testify, defending the men who'd held them with dynamite. That's the moment the police and the press needed an explanation, isn't it? A psychological one. Exactly. The authorities were facing huge criticism over how they handled the siege. The final assault almost killed the hostages. They needed a clean, simple story for the victims' shocking behavior, one that had nothing to do with police failures. Enter Nils Bajero. He was a Swedish psychiatrist advising the police during the standoff. He observed the hostages' reactions after release. Importantly, he didn't actually treat them, but he went on a news broadcast. And he described their responses as a classic brainwashing response. And right there, on air, he coined the label Stockholm Syndrome.
And the name just stuck instantly. Because it sounded medical, it sounded official, it gave a neat little box to put this completely illogical seeming behavior into victims loving their abusers. And conveniently, it took the heat off the authorities.
Absolutely. And its power just exploded globally only a year later with the Patty Hearst kidnapping in 1974. That was sensational. Hearst, granddaughter of the famous publisher William Randolph Hearst, abducted by the Symbionese Liberation Army, the SLA, a radical urban guerrilla group.
Totally different situation, right? Political radicals wanting revolution, not bank robbers wanting cash. But the public perception of that psychological shift, identical.
It was certainly presented that way. Hearst was held for weeks, blindfolded in a closet, physically abused, bombarded with the SLA's revolutionary ideas. She was isolated, starved, told she faced execution. Then, after this intense period of, coercive conditioning, tapes were released. Patty Hearst, using her new revolutionary name Tania, completely denounced her wealthy family, expressed total sympathy and solidarity with the SLA, and later she was famously photographed holding a carbine during an SLA bank robbery. So when she was finally arrested in 1975, her defense lawyer, the famous F. Lee Bailey, argued forcefully she'd been brainwashed, and he specifically explicitly used Stockholm Syndrome as the reason for her actions, her apparent change of heart. Now, she was initially convicted, did serve time, but her sentence was later commuted and eventually she got a presidential pardon, partly because the sheer level of coercion and trauma she endured became undeniable, but the term. Thanks to the massive global media coverage of both Credit Bankin and Patty Hearst, it instantly leaped out of clinical psychology and became a household phrase. Everyone knew what Stockholm Syndrome meant, or thought they did.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, I think. We move from just reciting the history to actually analyzing it critically. That foundational story, the one Bajero effectively sold to the world, it paints the hostages as passive victims of some kind of psychological disorder. But what if? What if that response wasn't a syndrome at all? What if it was a completely rational, high-stakes assessment of their actual circumstances, especially considering the failures of the authorities supposedly trying to save them?
That is the absolute core of the critique. It's the most powerful counterargument, and importantly, it comes from the actual testimony of the hostages themselves, speaking out decades later. The critique, basically, is that this syndrome narrative, it was created incredibly quickly, mostly by the authorities, and it served an immediate, very practical purpose: excuse the disorganized, dangerous, frankly problematic police response. It essentially shifted the blame for the near-fatal outcome, the police nearly killing everyone, onto the victims themselves, onto their supposed psychological weakness.
Let's focus back on Kristen Enmark for a moment. She was one of the central figures in that Stockholm bank robbery. Her later account paints a dramatically different picture of where the real danger felt like it was coming from.
Yes, her account is absolutely essential to understanding this critique. She details a police response that sounds, well, characterized by confusion and dismissal. For instance, she points out the police initially completely bumbled the operation. They wrongly identified the main robber as some guy named Kaj Hansen for the first 2 whole days. I mean, that speaks volumes about the police being disorganized, maybe incompetent. And Enmark and the other hostages, they were acutely aware of this confusion from inside the vault. But the really critical moment, the one she highlights, was her interaction with the police negotiator. At one point, Clark Olofsson escorted her out of the vault to speak to the chief negotiator on the phone. She desperately tried to communicate, to give them information about the captor's state of mind, the conditions inside, but the negotiator, he refused to speak to her. He insisted he would only talk to Clark Olofsson. Enmark later recalled feeling like the police treated her like a little dumb, ignorant girl who was not worth saying anything to whatsoever, much less listening to, just completely dismissed.
Wow. That feeling, that sense of complete dismissal, being dehumanized by the very people supposed to be rescuing you, that must have just shattered any trust the hostages had in the outside authorities. If the police won't even listen to you, treat you like your life doesn't matter, well, you're forced to rely on the people inside the vault with you, aren't you? Even if they're the ones holding the guns.
Exactly right. It creates this irreversible shift in perspective, you see. The hostages' immediate situation became one of shared danger. Them and the captors together against the external threat, a potentially deadly police assault. The positive rapport they developed wasn't just one-sided, it was a mutual exchange in a way. Olsen needed them alive to negotiate. A police assault put all their lives at risk without any consultation. So Enmark and the others, they quickly made a very pragmatic assessment. The police seemed dangerous, disorganized, unpredictable. The captors, especially Olofsson maybe, were behaving more rationally, more predictably, more defensively in that moment. So when Enmark defended Olofsson after release or expressed negative feelings towards the police, critics argue she wasn't being psychologically pathological. She was making a pragmatic, high-stakes calculation about who posed the greater and more immediate threat to her actual survival. The captors were a known quantity inside, the police were an unknown, erratic force outside.
And this loops right back to the coining of the term itself. The entire psychological narrative was basically cemented by Niels Bejerot, the psychiatrist who, as you pointed out, wasn't even treating the hostages, he was advising the police.
Yes, and this is a major, major point of the critique. It's what links that specific event in 1973 to this broader idea of the label being used sometimes as a kind of cultural weapon. Bejerot was an advisor to the police. He was embedded within the authority structure that was under intense public scrutiny for bungling the rescue attempt. His decision to label the victim's reaction a syndrome acted almost like a political and administrative safety valve. Think about it. If the victims are sick, if they're suffering from brainwashing, well, then the authorities are conveniently absolved of responsibility for that nearly fatal assault that ended the siege. The claim that Enmark, for instance, suffered from a syndrome was just an external label. It was applied without any real clinical analysis of her actual condition or motivations. This set a really powerful, and critics would say insidious, precedent. A precedent where authority can essentially just create a medical-sounding label on the spot to excuse its own failures, painting the victims as crazy for having what might have been a perfectly nuanced, self-preserving reaction to a terribly managed situation.
So in essence, the syndrome became a form of institutional gaslighting. The victim's rational fear of the authorities gets pathologized. The narrative shifts back to individual psychological failure, away from any institutional incompetence or mistakes.
Absolutely. That's a good way to put it. Survival in that specific context required the hostages to cooperate, didn't it? To build some kind of relationship of mutual interest with the captors, and yes, to fear that violent external intervention. By labeling that survival strategy a syndrome, it effectively makes the victim's own testimony, their own perspective, inadmissible in the public square. It's just a quick, clean way for those in power to regain control of the narrative.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Let's try to apply some actual psychological theory to this survival response. We have to acknowledge that while the label's origin is, deeply problematic, the response itself, bonding under duress, is a real, observable survival strategy in extreme situations. So what are the core psychological concepts that might help us understand why this kind of attachment forms?
Well, the prevailing theories, many rooted in psychoanalytic thought, basically posit that Stockholm Syndrome, or this kind of response, is a profound survival mechanism. When you place individuals in a life or death situation where the power difference is just absolute, the victim's fundamental need to survive overrides almost every other impulse. including the impulse to hate the person who created the whole terrifying dilemma in the first place. So the positive emotional bond, in this view, it's seen as a highly effective, albeit maybe pathological from an outside view, ego defense mechanism. It kicks in under extreme, prolonged stress. The victim is essentially using a form of pathological transference. They're unconsciously trying to shift the relationship dynamic away from powerless victim versus all-powerful captor towards something more like two humans sharing a dangerous space trying to get through it.
You mentioned Anna Freud's concept earlier, identification with the aggressor. Let's spend a bit more time on that because it seems like a really crucial insight into how a victim might try to regain some kind of psychological footing.
Right, identification with the aggressor. It's a way to cope with just overwhelming fear. Psychologically, the victim tries to transform themselves from the person being threatened into the one doing the threatening, or at least aligning with them. So the victim starts incorporating the aggressor's behaviors, maybe their attitudes, sometimes even their belief systems. It's a defense mechanism that provides profound, even if it's ultimately illusory, sense of psychological power or control. Think about it like this. If I adopt the worldview of the person holding the gun, right, or if I learn to anticipate their needs, maybe even meet them before they ask, psychologically, I'm putting myself in a position where I feel like I have some control over the dynamic. The threat is still obviously there, but my brain interprets my actions as lessening that threat. I'm no longer just passive prey waiting for the worst. I'm an active participant in keeping the peace. And in that vault, keeping the peace meant staying alive. So it's really a coping mechanism designed to reduce terror and anxiety. It's not, crucially, an expression of genuine affection or attraction towards the captor.
And central to this whole process you mentioned is this idea of small kindness perception, where given the relentless focus on just staying alive, the brain completely overamplifies tiny acts of decency.
Absolutely. The perception gets fundamentally warped by the sheer intensity of the duress. When a person is subjected to immense, constant, life-threatening deprivation, any small act of kindness, like maybe a captor gives a shivering hostage a coat, or provides a small amount of food, or even just the simple absence of abuse, like not being beaten or raped when you expected you might be, that gets interpreted by the victim's stressed brain as evidence of a positive trait in the captor. The cognitive shift is profound. The captor stops being seen solely as the person who created the terror and starts being seen as the person who is allowing the victim to live, moment to moment. Because the victim is hyper-focused on survival, they grab onto that tiny thread of humanity. They amplify any rare positive behavior because it offers a glimmer of hope that the situation is manageable, survivable. The captor becomes, in a twisted way, the provider of life, not just the cause of terror.
Now, this is really important because in modern usage, the SS label gets thrown around a lot and often gets mixed up with a much broader, though equally damaging psychological phenomenon called trauma bonding. We really need to draw a clear line between these two.
Yes, that distinction is absolutely paramount. Our sources really emphasize this. Stockholm Syndrome, technically, should only be reserved for situations of captivity, kidnapping, or imprisonment, where the threat to life is external, immediate, and prolonged. It's meant to be a specific response to a very specific coercive environment. Trauma bonding, on the other hand, that describes the enduring emotional attachment that often occurs in abusive relationships more generally. You see it in domestic violence, in cults, and some child abuse situations. It's a dynamic where the connection defies logic, seems unbreakable from the outside. The critical difference is, trauma bonding doesn't necessarily require literal physical captivity. It requires cycles of abuse, rewards, and psychological punishment within an ongoing relationship.
And the key psychological engine driving that trauma bonding, which is essential if you want to understand why victims might return to or defend abusers, is something called intermittent reinforcement. This is what makes that emotional bond feel almost addictive, so incredibly hard to break.
Right. Intermittent reinforcement. It's a foundational concept from behavioral psychology, and it is extremely powerful. It's basically a pattern of cruel, callous, abusive treatment mixed with random, sporadic, unpredictable bursts of affection, kindness, or positive attention. That unpredictability, that's the psychological hook. Think about it like a slot machine, you know? If every single time you pulled the lever you lost, you just start playing pretty quickly. If every time you pulled the lever you won big, well, the win would eventually become unremarkable, maybe even boring. But if you win just often enough, randomly, unpredictably, your brain gets hooked on the possibility of the next win. In an abusive relationship, the victim becomes perpetually motivated, almost desperate to seek the abuser's approval, always waiting, hoping for that next random burst of positivity, of love.
So the victim is, in a way, rewarded just for enduring the abuse. And the abuser gets positive credit simply for not being abusive in moments where maybe abuse was expected. It's this insane cognitive loop that really locks the victim in place.
Absolutely. The abuser maintains total control by making sure that the positive behavior, the flowers after a beating, the tearful apology, the sudden calm discussion is totally out of sync with the abusive behavior. It fundamentally confuses the victim's ability to assess reality. It makes it incredibly difficult to break the attachment because the brain is constantly craving, constantly hoping for that positive fix, that reinforcement.
Okay, so given how pervasive trauma bonding seems to be in society and different kinds of relationships, it might be easy to assume that true Stockholm Syndrome in actual hostage situations is also really widespread. But the FBI research suggests something different, doesn't it? How rare is this observable phenomenon, really?
It's actually far rarer than the media sensationalism might lead you to believe. The FBI conducted a pretty significant study, looked at over 1,200 hostage-taking incidents, and they found that only about 8% of the people involved developed observable characteristics that could reasonably be labeled as Stockholm Syndrome, which means, conversely, 92% of hostages did not develop it. This really underscores a crucial point. Yes, SS is a real potential response to extreme stress, but it is definitely not the typical or expected or default human reaction to being taken captive. It's more of an anomaly, one that's been significantly amplified by media attention.
That phrase, Stockholm Syndrome, it just proved incredibly effective rhetorically, didn't it? It achieved this immediate public understanding, this explanatory power. And as we discussed, the label didn't stay confined to that bank vault or even just kidnappings for long. It started showing up everywhere.
Oh, the domain expansion has been absolutely vast and often really controversial. The label now gets used to explain almost any behavior that seems from the outside contradictory to a person's self-interest, especially in situations involving some kind of systematic power imbalance. So you hear it applied to battered women who defend their partners or resist leaving, abused children who might resist reporting their abuser or being removed from the home, and individuals in other highly restrictive environments like prisoners of war, sometimes concentration camp survivors, victims of sex trafficking, and, quite commonly, members of high control groups or cults. A good example, look at the NXIVM cult scandal with Keith Raniere. Allison Mack, the actress involved, she displayed this really intense, consistent loyalty to Raniere even during his trial, refused to speak against him, defended his ideology. Now, Mack was subjected to profound coercive conditions, blackmail, isolation, explicit threats, and her actions were widely, almost universally, categorized in the media as a classic case of Stockholm Syndrome. It demonstrates just how useful the label is for explaining the loyalty of someone who's clearly been manipulated.
Which brings us right back to the crucial sociological function of this label. Why is this medical-sounding term so appealing, so powerful? When we apply it to these really complex social problems, why do we reach for it so quickly?
Well, sociologists often talk about Stockholm Syndrome as being a kind of vernacular resource, meaning it performs immediate rhetorical work in public discourse. It just works really well as a shortcut. It provides a simple, satisfying, medicalized explanation for behaviors that are otherwise just frustratingly incomprehensible or maybe morally confusing to an outside observer. You know, why would a woman return to an abusive partner for the 12th time? Why would a victim of incest resist being taken away from the abusive home? The label solves the puzzle instantly. Oh, it's a syndrome. It's a pathology. Something is wrong with them. And more insidiously, perhaps, this medicalization can function as a highly effective rhetorical power play. When someone, maybe a lawyer, a journalist, a politician, labels a person as suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, it's often used to neutralize opposing viewpoints, or maybe even to discredit the victim's own agency and perspective.
Right. So if a victim is trying to explain, maybe defend, why they're staying in an abusive relationship, the moment someone slaps the label Stockholm Syndrome on them, the actual content of their defense, their reasons, they just become completely irrelevant.
Precisely. Their testimony, their lived experience is just dismissed out at hand. Why? Because the very act of defending the abuser or the situation is itself pathologized. The person is immediately identified as traumatized and sick. And that effectively excuses the listener or society from needing to actually engage with the complex, often messy reasons why they might be making that choice. Reasons like economic dependence, sheer terror of greater retribution if they leave, or those deep cognitive distortions induced by long-term trauma bonding. The label simply tells society, this person cannot think straight. Don't listen to them.
We really need to explore the case of Yvonne Ridley here. It puts this rhetorical power into such stark light. She's a former journalist whose experience became a real touchstone for this whole controversy.
Yes, Yvonne Ridley. She was captured and held for 11 days by the Taliban in Afghanistan back in 2001. After her release, she returned to the UK. And then in 2003, she converted to Islam. She subsequently became a very outspoken activist, a strong critic of Western foreign policy and media representation of Muslims, and she expressed powerful pro-Islamic and, well, anti-Western intervention views. The reaction from many of her critics was immediate and utterly dismissive. They just couldn't fathom that a professional Western white woman would seemingly reject Western values and embrace Islam and its associated politics. Therefore, the easiest way, the quickest way to deal with this inconvenient conversion was to universally attribute her religious and political shift to, you guessed it, Stockholm Syndrome. They argued her new beliefs weren't genuine spiritual conclusions or political stances, but rather the lingering psychological damage from her trauma.
So the label became essentially an attack strategy, designed purely to discredit her credibility, undermine her platform, dismiss her arguments without engaging them.
Exactly. It allowed detractors to completely avoid addressing the actual substance of what she was saying. However, Ridley herself vehemently rejected the SS label. She often stated in interviews that she did not bond with her captors at all. She famously described herself as having been the prisoner from hell, said she spat at them, swore at them, threw her food, was intentionally aggressive and rude throughout her captivity. She insisted she resisted any pressure to espouse Islamic views while held captive, although she did promise her captors she would read the Quran upon release, which she later claimed led to a genuine spiritual awakening for her.
And yet, as so often happens in these public debates, the more she rejected the label, the more outspoken her views became, the more her critics just doubled down, insisting she must be suffering from the disorder. It's a catch-22.
It creates a perfect trap, doesn't it? Her denial of the syndrome was simply framed by critics as further evidence of her disordered thinking, proof of the long-term trauma. The label was used deliberately to neutralize her entire public persona, her voice. Her experience really powerfully illustrates how this SS framework gets deployed in public claims making, often not for any kind of psychological accuracy, but purely to medicalize and therefore invalidate an inconvenient or politically problematic perspective.
Okay, let's shift now and look at some of those really high-profile, long-term captivity cases. The ones where the media and the public just instantly reached for that Stockholm Syndrome label. And let's see how maybe under closer analysis, those cases reveal more about sophisticated survival tactics and intense psychological manipulation rather than any genuine affection.
Right. The Pettyhurst case, as we discussed, is really the foundational example in the public mind. But it deserves a deeper look at the actual mechanics of the coercion used by the SLA. They didn't just hold her captive. They implemented a very systematic program designed specifically to fracture her identity and her existing beliefs. During her early captivity, remember, she was kept in that small, dark closet, often blindfolded, stripped of sensory input, starved, constantly threatened with execution. That's classic sensory deprivation, used for high-level coercion and breaking someone down. Then, the SLA introduced their radical rhetoric. They forced her to listen to their manifestos for hours on end, and they made it absolutely clear that her life depended entirely on her publicly adopting their worldview.
So her initial compliance, her participation in that bank robbery, which just stunned the world. Right. It wasn't really an expression of affection or belief, was it? It sounds more like the immediate coerced result of her identity being systematically fractured under the constant threat of death.
Precisely. Her lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, leveraged the SS defense by arguing exactly that she was psychologically broken, acting under extreme duress. It was a defense that acknowledged the coercion, but was still fundamentally rooted in the idea of a mental failing, a syndrome. And while the jury did ultimately convict her, the later pardon implicitly acknowledged that the psychological conditioning she endured was just extreme, beyond normal comprehension. Her case really forced the media, and eventually the legal system, to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that apparent loyalty can be entirely manufactured through systematic torture and identity manipulation.
Moving to more recent history, the Elizabeth Smart case generated huge amounts of Stockholm Syndrome speculation, didn't it? Especially when journalists started claiming she'd missed perceived opportunities to escape during those 9 months she was held.
Yes, her experience reveals so much about the profound difference between rational fear and emotional affection. Elizabeth Smart was abducted in 2002, held by Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee. She endured horrific violence, sexual assault, isolation. But the real, almost diabolical genius of Mitchell's control wasn't primarily physical restraint. It was psychological, based entirely on leveraging her deep love for her family. Mitchell repeatedly, constantly played into her selflessness by threatening to kill her entire family. He didn't just threaten to kill her if she ran. He threatened to track down and murder her baby brother, her parents. He explicitly told her over and over that any retribution, including the murder of her family, would be entirely her fault if she ever tried to escape.
My God. So any attempt at escape, which we'd normally see as self-preservation, was instantly reframed in her mind as an act of selfish betrayal against everyone she loved most.
That is the ultimate psychological trap. It's absolutely paralyzing. Her survival motto, as she later described it, became, "Think about your family. Remember that they love you. Do whatever it takes to protect them, whatever it takes to survive." So her cooperation, her compliance in wearing veils in public, her silence when occasionally questioned by strangers or even police, it wasn't based on any affection for Mitchell or Bursey. It was a desperate, rational attempt to follow the terrifying rules that she believed with absolute certainty were keeping her family alive. And crucially, when she was finally recovered, her behavior completely debunked the SS speculation. The moment police assured her she was safe, that her family was alive and desperately looking for her, she immediately, willingly identified herself and went with the authorities. There was absolutely no loyalty, no defense of her captors, no lingering positive bond whatsoever. The media's relentless focus on the SS angle in her case. It was correctly identified by many advocates as a form of victim blaming, simplifying 9 months of complex terror and psychological manipulation into a convenient, easily digestible diagnosis.
This complexity just seems magnified in cases of extremely lengthy captivity, where the victim's identity itself can be almost completely fractured or reshaped by the abuser. Cases like J.C. Dugard and Colleen Stan combine horrifying examples of this long-term conditioning.
Absolutely. J.C. Dugard was held captive for 18 long years. She was systematically isolated, repeatedly abused, and tragically gave birth to 2 daughters fathered by her captor, Philip Garrido. Critical to maintaining her compliance over all those years was Garrido's sophisticated, cruel lie. He convinced her utterly that her family no longer wanted her, that they had stopped looking for her years ago. In that profound isolation, coupled with the violence, she became entirely dependent on Garrido for all social interaction, all emotional connection. She was essentially forced to cherish any human interaction, even with her abuser, because he and their daughters were the only source of connection she had known for nearly 2 decades. And Colleen Stan, often called the girl in the box, she was held for 7 years, much of that time literally spent locked inside a small wooden box, barely large enough to lie down in. She was subjected to horrific violence, abuse, and profound isolation. Crucially, her captor, Cameron Hooker, invented this elaborate, completely fictional secret organization he called the Company, or sometimes the Slave Company. He convinced Stan that this powerful, shadowy group was watching her constantly and would brutally torture and kill her entire family if she ever attempted to escape or disobey his orders in any way.
That constant external threat, even if it's entirely fictional, must be absolutely paralyzing, especially when the victim has already been so thoroughly broken down by abuse and isolation.
It is entirely paralyzing because the victim has no way to verify if it's true or not. Even when Hooker eventually gave Stan increased freedom, she sometimes worked outside the home, had moments where escape seemed physically possible. She made no attempt. Her lack of escape wasn't due to affection for Hooker, not at all. It was due to a complete erosion of her independent sense of reality and her absolute terrified belief that Hooker's threats about the company were real and the consequences inevitable. She'd been psychologically broken, as she later described it, to the point where her only perceived path to safety for herself and her family lay in total compliance.
And finally, let's touch on Sean Hornbeck. His behavior immediately after his rescue was held up by the public, by the media, almost as the textbook definition of Stockholm Syndrome, wasn't it?
Yes. Sean Hornbeck was held captive for over 4 years, abducted when he was just 11. He was actually kept in relatively plain sight in his captor's apartment, often interacting with the outside world to some degree. The most famous, and to many, the most baffling incident occurred when some school friends who had seen missing person flyers with his photo actually approached him in public. They asked him directly, "Are you Sean Hornbeck?" And he denied it. He denied his own identity, insisted he was someone else, said he was fine. This denial of self, this rejection of his own identity observed directly by others, it immediately raised the specter of Stockholm Syndrome in the media and public consciousness. But analysts often understand this kind of behavior as severe dissociation, or maybe an identity split. It's a survival tactic. When the trauma is so extreme, especially for a child, the mind can sometimes create a separate, compliant persona just to navigate the abuse, essentially walling off and protecting the core self. So the child who denies his identity, that's the captive persona speaking. The persona that has learned through brutal experience that admitting the truth, revealing his real identity, leads to pain, punishment, and further isolation. It really highlights how quickly the public jumps to that convenient medicalized label SS when a victim's actions defy our simple expectation that they should just immediately seek freedom the first chance they get.
Right. The reality, it seems, across all these incredibly difficult cases is that the victim's compliance, their seeming cooperation, it speaks far less to any kind of affection and much more to intense psychological control, deliberately enforced cognitive distortions, and the completely rational fear that the captor's threats against family or against self will absolutely be carried out.
So, just to reiterate the official status here and bring some clinical clarity back to this whole discussion, Stockholm Syndrome is not recognized as a distinct diagnosable mental illness or disorder in any of the major psychiatric classification manuals. That includes the DSM-5, which is the standard in North America, and the ICD-11, the global standard from the World Health Organization. There are simply no clinically agreed upon diagnostic criteria for identifying this syndrome. It's much better understood and certainly treated as a complex, often extreme, behavioral response to trauma, to intense coercion and overwhelming stress.
That distinction feels absolutely crucial. It's a pattern of survival behavior, maybe a coping mechanism, not a clinical disorder you can, put a code on for insurance purposes. Before we talk about treatment, maybe we should just briefly revisit that reciprocal phenomenon you mentioned earlier, Lima syndrome. Because that adds another layer, doesn't it? It gives insight into maybe shared humanity or perhaps even manipulative calculation on the captor's side, too.
Right, Lima syndrome. That refers to the development of positive feelings, maybe sympathy, maybe even empathy, by the captor towards their captives. This was actually reported to have occurred, interestingly, back in the original Norrmalmstorg robbery. Some of the women hostages felt that Clark Olofsson, the good cop captor, actually protected them from the more erratic and terrifying actions of Jane Erik Olsen. This dynamic, where the captor is also affected by the shared experience, maybe starts to see the victim as human. It's significant, because it can potentially lead the captor to be less aggressive, maybe even more protective in certain ways, which of course can further cement the victim's reliance on that captor, complicating that simple binary of good versus evil.
Okay, so since SS, or this kind of severe trauma bonding, is fundamentally understood as a trauma response, what's the modern therapeutic approach look like for a survivor who's experienced this intense level of psychological conditioning?
The absolute focus has to be on trauma-informed care. The main goals are, first, to help the survivor regain their sense of empowerment, their sense of agency. And second, to carefully dismantle these severe cognitive distortions that actually enabled their survival during the captivity or abuse. The kinds of modalities often used include things like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is great for challenging distorted thought patterns, and also eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, which is known to be highly effective in processing deeply traumatic memories and reducing their emotional charge. Treatment specifically targets those cognitive distortions we talked about. Things like the victim rationalizing the abuser's cruelty, they only hit me because I provoked them. Or adopting the abuser's warped perspective on the world. They were right, the outside world is dangerous, I'm safer here. Or, very commonly, taking the blame for the abuse. If I had just been perfect, if I hadn't made that mistake, they wouldn't have hurt me.
So the ultimate aim is really to dismantle that survival mechanism, the one that equated compliance with safety, and to help restore the victim's own independent sense of reality, their own agency, helping them see that the perpetrator twisted things like unconditional love or even just basic human decency into something conditional, something that had to be constantly earned or worked for under threat.
And that is incredibly difficult work, because the psychological tactics used by captors and chronic abusers, the isolation, the degradation, the identity manipulation, that intermittent reinforcement we discussed, they are all highly effective at making the victim feel utterly powerless, making them feel that no matter what they do, the perpetrator is always in control, and that the outside world is somehow always the greater threat. Recovery means painstakingly rebuilding the internal scaffolding of the self, piece by piece.
This entire deep dive, then, tracing the origin of this term back to a moment of, arguably, police error and media frenzy, it really leads us back to the power of the label itself, doesn't it? We've established that the initial label pretty clearly helped authorities deflect criticism. So maybe for a final provocative thought for our listeners, what does the sheer persistence, the widespread, almost casual use of the Stockholm Syndrome label today, what did that tell us about society rather than just about the psychology of the victim?
Well, that's the crucial question, isn't it? If the initial syndrome was, at least in large part, a kind of fabrication, created primarily to protect institutional authority and excuse operational failures back in 1973, then we absolutely must ask ourselves, how often is that label still used today? In the media, in politics, in legal debates, in everyday social discourse, how often is it used not really as a tool for understanding complex trauma, but more as a quick, easy mechanism to invalidate an inconvenient truth, or to dismiss a complicated reality about a victim's survival choices? The sheer ease, the readiness with which we often apply the label, it suggests that maybe it tells us far more about the claims maker, about the person using the label, and perhaps about society's own discomfort with ambiguity and victim agency, than it actually does about the victim's internal state. If someone immediately jumps to labeling a person with Stockholm Syndrome just because their actions or beliefs are hard to accept, whether it's a political convert like Yvonne Ridley, or maybe a mother trying to explain her decision to leave and then return to an abusive spouse, well, that person using the label is very likely attempting to instantly discredit the individual they're labeling.
They're essentially diverting attention, aren't they? Away from the systemic failures that might be surrounding that individual, things like lack of support systems, maybe police incompetence or indifference, economic desperation, societal inaction on issues like domestic violence. All the factors that might have necessitated those extreme survival choices in the first place.
Exactly. The label allows us to comfortably blame the victim's individual psychology. We label them as having a malfunction, a syndrome. And that lets us avoid confronting the atrocity of the crime itself or the surrounding systemic failures that allowed it to happen or continue. The persistence of the term keeps the conversation conveniently focused on individual pathology rather than shifting it towards collective responsibility for maybe enabling the conditions of abuse. So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is to always question, who benefits when a victim is labeled sick?
A really crucial, challenging thought to end on. If the diagnosis itself exists, even partly to silence critique, then we absolutely must remain critical of the diagnosis itself.